Hi, Ken.
Hi there. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Great. So I thought a good way to kind of talk about some techniques on albums that you've worked on over the years, maybe to go through each instrument at a time and kind of talk about how your techniques have evolved and how techniques that you've witnessed other people have used evolved. Maybe if we start with the drums, what were the kind of techniques that were going on when those kind of early Beatles records that you were just like the assistant on? Was there a lot of like under miking of things rather than over miking?
Very, very simple. I think, if I remember correctly, it was just something like a KM56 or a 4038 overhead, and then a D20 on bass drum. That was it. To start, as when I was an assistant engineer, that's what it was. Then it started to. I was taken off of assistant engineering for a while whilst I did mastering. And during that period, it changed because Jeff Emmerich took over and things started to change a little then. And there were a few more mics. Generally, the mics during that period, which I started off copying because, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. I started off copying Jeff, which was, I think, if I remember correctly, it was something like a D19 overhead, a D9. It was all mostly all D19s and still the D20 on bass drum.
Do you remember the positions of a lot of those mics? Because there's a lot of things that people wouldn't traditionally do these days, really.
And the problem with trying to say anything about what happened on Beatles sessions is it was changing all the time.
Right.
One of the greatest things for me as a trainee engineer, the first session I ever did, the first time I ever sat behind a mixing console was on a bloody Beatles session. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So that's why I followed on with Jeff's way of working, because that's all I had to follow someone, so he'd been working with them, so it made a lot of sense to follow what Jeff did. But working with the one band in the world that had no monetary problems, there were no budget problems for them, there were no time constraints, and they wanted everything to sound different every time that it was recorded. So I could experiment all I wanted to, knowing that that's what they wanted. And so I got to try different mics in different positions through the entire sort of Magical Mystery Tour White Album time. And that's how I learned what mics I liked, what mics I didn't, what positions I liked, and all of that kind of thing. And following on from that, I've remained pretty damn constant all of these years, like over 50 years. It's much the same as I always used to.
Maybe if we could talk a little bit about those kind of standard technique over the last 50 years then. What are a lot of your go-tos, kind of Mike's techniques for drums?
What I do now with drums is it will be 87s on toms. Back then it was 67s, but obviously most places don't have those now, so it's moved on to 87s. Overheads would still be Cole 4038s, two of them. A snare, top mic'd. Most of the time these days it's a Sony C38A. I did for a period of time use a KM56 or a KM54. And I sort of go between those or the Sony. But just recently I much preferred the Sony. The bass drum is an RE20. And that's basically it. It's easy. The positioning is for snare and toms, it's off to the side as close as I can get it to the drum, aiming towards where the drummer is supposed to hit, which is dead center of the head. And that works for me. As far as under miking on a snare, I will only ever do that if it's a drummer comes in with a really deep snare. Otherwise, I absolutely hate it. I get exactly what I want from top miking.
Were those techniques that you started to develop working with the Beatles?
Well, just that positioning and generally the mics that I now use. That all came from back then, trying different mics. It was at that point with them, there was one time I went into the mic room with Paul, and he wanted to try a different mic on something. I have no idea what it was now, but he wanted to try a different mic on something. We're going around. I'm looking around at all the different mics, thinking what might sound the best. He's just looking around. He says, "Oh, I like the look of that one. Let's use that." That was where they were coming from. It was at that particular time. It was the look of it was more important than the sound of it. But it was experimentation all the time.
Can you think of any specific examples of kind of weird mic techniques you might have used during those days?
I'm sure there were plenty, but I can't remember any off the top of my head. Everything from with piano, we would mic on top with one mic. We'd mic underneath with one mic. We just put them in different places to get different sounds. Even the in different places within the studio. Moving from number 2 into the small room, which was right by the side of number 2's control room, and them all playing live vocal as well, in this ridiculously small room. If one of them moved around too fast, one of the others would have lost their head. To come up with specific things that we did differently is really, really hard after all this time, because there were just so many things. From recording, Mother Nature's Son, the bass drum on that was recorded at the bottom of a staircase at the end of the corridor from number 2 studio. Just another one of those type of things. It was try everything.
You mentioned piano there. What have kind of some of your standard piano recording techniques been, and how they evolved over time?
It's gone from the single mic, which it started to become everything from a D19C through a Sony C38A through one U67. Then once we started to get more tracks and we needed more into stereo, we needed stereo piano. So then it moved to 2 mics, which was 267s or 287s today, high and low. I started to have some phasing problems. So the way I get around that is I just put another mic up the center and just use it enough to get rid of the phasing between 2. But the way I do it these days is it will be a KM probably a KM 84 on the high end, then 2 87s, one mid and one low end.
What do you think kind of changed the use of dynamic mics a lot? Because in the 60s, obviously they were using dynamic mics on a lot of different things, and that's kind of not very commonplace now.
Who knows why anything changes? Who knows why suddenly, round about the end of the mid to end of the 40s, the most incredible talent came out of this one small island, from guitars to songwriters to singers to engineers to producers. Just this massive amount, all just happened at once. And it's much the same. Anything to do with music should be constantly growing and changing. And the same with mic techniques and sound. And generally, what quite often happens is that something will phase out, something else will take over, and then after a period of time, what had been phased out now suddenly becomes in again. So I'm sure any techniques from back then will come back in again at some point. That's why so many of the plugins these days is just emulating what we used to use back then. They were sold dirt cheap. There was that period of time when suddenly Fairchild 660s, they're old hat, we don't want to use them. And they got sold off dirt cheap. Now try and buy them, it's impossible. And they're ridiculously expensive. Everything comes back in and goes out. And it's just cyclical. Everything is cyclical.
Maybe moving on to electric guitar, was it often just kind of one mic on the electric on those Beatles sessions?
From Beatles sessions all the way through to today, one mic on the amp. Sometimes will be a room mic, and what that room mic is, I have no preference. It's just whatever's laying around generally, because the room mic ain't going to make that much difference. It's to try and give a slightly bigger sound, or to take some of the presence off the guitar to sync it back more in the mix.
What are some of your favourite close mics?
It's 87. You'll hear almost everything I say is an 87.
Right.
That's my favourite mic. I use it on almost everything.
Would that have been a 67 then in the Beatles days?
It would. And that was it. It took a little while for me to get into it that much because I was trying other mics. But eventually, that was the one that won out every time.
Do you have a standard position for it?
Right in the middle, that far away. I am so much of a creature of habit. Everything is always the same. To me, the sound should come from the instrument and the studio. It shouldn't come from the control room. And going back to drums for a minute, a quick story about the whole thing of it coming from the drum kit, the instrument and the player. I was doing some sessions for the co-writer of my book. And because he was producing, he said, would you like to engineer? I said, yeah, I'd love to. And it was this hard rock band. We came to the last two numbers that we had to record. And we were talking about it, and it was decided we needed two completely different drum sounds for each song. The drummer had several different kits. So he came in the day we were going to cut the basic tracks for this with a couple of kits. We set up the first one, moved all the mics in. He played, I got the EQ, the levels and all of that kind of thing. Got the sound that we wanted for the first number. Few takes, we got it. I pulled all of the mics back out. He moved first drum kit out, moved the next drum kit back in. I moved all the mics back in exactly the same positions. I didn't have to change anything else. We got exactly the drum sound we wanted for the second song. And the only thing that changed was the drum kit, nothing else. And it worked perfectly. And the EQ I do almost every time on drums, it's so close to being the same every time. Bobby Ozinski, the co-writer of my book I was working with, he said that what he discovered working with me is that I EQ for the mic, that what I consider the deficiencies of the mic, not for the instrument. I leave the instrument in the studio getting the sound that's required out there. And that comes from the whole Abbey Road, or EMI back then, situation, because the EQ we had on those red desks was so limited. You had to get the sound in the studio. And that stuck with me ever since.
I remember you saying with those EQs that they kind of asked you to crank the low end and top end. Was that something that was pretty common?
No, it wasn't common at all. It was something that they requested on some of the mixes on the White Album. They'd just come in, okay, full bass, full treble and everything. It's the Beatles, you don't argue, you do it. And you've heard how they sound, because that's what we've been listening to for 40 odd years, until Giles went and did what Giles does a lot of these days.
How did their use of compression kind of evolve over time? Because you can clearly kind of hear it being introduced in some of the albums.
Once again, we were so limited back then. We would have, because we were concentrating so much on mono, not on stereo, it would be a single 660 and a single, it was the Altec compressors, I can't remember what the serial numbers are, RS something or other, that EMI had, both of which had been modified by the EMI technicians. And that was it. We would tend to use the Altec compressor we'd always use on bass, sometimes on guitar, sometimes on piano. The Fairchild 660 was always on vocals. With Ringo, it would be on the drum kit, sometimes on piano. That was generally the way we recorded everything. And very much it was doing everything going into the tape machine. We had to, because we were mixing things together on one track. So we had to EQ everything and compress, limit everything going to tape, and we'd have to do very little on the mixing, except turn full bass and full treble up when they wanted it.
Were they generally using compression on everything, if possible?
No, for Ringo it was always on the drums. For Paul it was always on the bass. For vocals, always the 660. Other than that, guitars, everything else, it was up for grabs. Piano, up for grabs. Sometimes it depended on what we were going for sound-wise.
You mentioned bass. I've heard quite a lot of kind of different claims about how they would record bass. Like some people saying they used DI, some people saying they never did. What was the kind of standard or some of the usual techniques for recording Paul's bass?
DI. I honestly can't remember what mic I finished up using with Paul. I know that Jeff used a C12. I may have continued. I'm sure I started off using a C12 for a bit. I may have moved over to a 67. I honestly can't remember. But there were so many different things. By the time that I was engineering with them, within the experimentation side, on a lot of the tracks on the White Album, there are two basses. There's a 6-string and a 4-string, and it's not always Paul playing. It will be Paul and someone, or it could also be John and George if Paul was playing piano. And they never worked out the parts beforehand. They had a rough idea of what each of them were going for on the bass track, but they would vary slightly. And there are vocal bass parts. It was all experimental.
Do they ever use the amp and the DI simultaneously, kind of how you would now?
Oh, sometimes, yeah. Without a doubt, we did that.
Would you generally be doing them both through one compressor, or was it less?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, through one.
How did all the red desks back then have phase controls on at all, or you have to do it manually, kind of? I don't remember thinking much about phase or anything like that back then. I still don't that much. If it sounds good, it's fine. If it doesn't, then try changing the phase. And if it gets better, fine. If it doesn't, then go back to what it was. It's very simple for me. I'm interested in the final product, what it sounds like in the end, not the individual things that go into doing it. We've become too picky about little things. Every little thing has to be perfect. No, it bloody doesn't. It's the overall thing has to be as good as you can get it. But within that, you can have lots of mistakes. You can have bad sounds. I always say with guitars, I'm not a big fan of the sound of modern day guitars. A lot of them, because the pickups, they're made to get rid of hisses and hums and all of that kind of thing. And through doing that, the high outputs that they give, I find a lot of the sounds become very similar. It's not like it used to be where you had a Les Paul would have its own sound and a Strat would have its own. The originals had their own unique ability. And the problem was sometimes you'd have extraneous noise that you don't want coming out of them. But if there's a hum coming from the guitar, as soon as you bring up the bass guitar as well, you're not going to hear that hum. As long as the guitar tone is what you're after, it doesn't matter if there's something below that. If there's hiss, bring the cymbals in, bring the overheads in, you're not going to hear that hiss unless it's an absolute solo instrument. All of that added noise, all of that kind of thing, it's bullshit. You never hear it. That's my opinion, anyway. I know there are a lot of people that would disagree. Would the Beatles experiment with kind of changing around guitars, what type of guitar they were using, and those sort of things?
They were using lots of different guitars, lots of different amps. It was whatever they finished up deciding sounded the best for that particular track. There was no rhyme or reason to any of it. It was just they'd pick up a guitar, start playing something. No, that one's not right. And try something else, which goes along with that, getting the sound in the studio. They weren't asking us upstairs, I have to use this guitar and amp, but I want it to sound totally different. Change it. they would be getting the sound that they wanted to a point in the studio.
Just going back to the sort of bass recording a little bit, were the mics generally quite far from the bass cabinets? Because that's what I've seen Jeff do.
Not really.
Right.
Not that far. These days, if I'm using a mic, I tend to use DI more than I do mic. But if I'm using a mic on bass, it's almost exactly the same as I do for guitar. It's the same distance, same position, and the same mic, the 87.
Is that what you would have been doing on the kind of Bowie and Lou Reed, Elton John records?
Yeah, it's Elton was. I thought that it was always a DI, but listening to some of the multi-tracks, you can hear piano and everything coming through on the bass track. So obviously, I used the mic for some of it, but I don't. When I did what, I don't know. As far as Trevor on the Bowie stuff, once again, I think it was all DI, and listening to multi-tracks on that, I haven't heard anything else bleeding through. So that further enhances my recollection that it was just DI. Did
a lot of these people care? You were saying they kind of cared about how the mics looked rather than how they sounded. Did any of the Beatles or Bowie or anyone have favourite mics for their maybe like vocals? Did they care what you were using?
It was whatever I chose to have them sing through.
Did they ever ask to like change the microphone or change the position?
Not that I remember. Maybe with the Beatles, just because of all the experimentation. But other than that, no, it was pretty straightforward. It would always have been, when I was at EMI, Abbey Road, it would have been a 47, would have been the main one to go for. At Trident, which would have been, and from my time at Trident, it would either have been a 67 or a C12A, and then 414.
Did your kind of techniques and EQing change when you went to Trident, and there were presumably more different outboard things available?
The EQ on the board was a little more radical, just a little. You could, you'd hear it work more than you would on the Red Desks. The Red Desk EQ was very smooth. That's how you could get away with putting full bass and full treble on, and not have it sound ridiculous. The Sound Technique board at Trident when I first went there, which was an amazing, amazing board. The amount of stuff done through that one mixing console, from its being in the studio initially, and then being moved up to the mix room. So it was part of all of the work at Trident for many, many years. That had a little more EQ. You could actually choose where you added or cut the EQ, but it was still on the low end. You only had two frequencies that you could choose between. You could only do one of the two. The high and mids, you had the choice of 1 out of 7. So you still didn't have that much control. We had in the studio, we had one parametric equalizer. I'm trying to think who made it. It's escaped me for the moment. And you had, I think there were 3 compressors, a Uri and a couple of LA2As, if I'm not mistaken. So and the mics they had were pretty much the same as, other than the 47s, everything else was pretty much the same as at EMI.
What was your standard vocal mic for David Bowie?
Either a 67 or a 414. I say 414. Back then it would have been a C12A. There are some pictures taken at Chateau d'Ereuville when we were doing pin-ups that show David singing into one of those. And whether I used that for all of the vocals or not, I'm not sure. But the 2 vocal mics I would have gone for would have been either a 67 or a or C12A.
Was that the same with Elton John?
Yes, I did for a while go through setting up two mics. It was always either a 414 or a C12A and a 67 or 87, and I put them sort of like that at 90 degrees to each other. Have the singer sing directly in between both of them, and I could mix them however I wanted to, use one or the other. For a while, I thought it cut back on pops and things like that, but eventually I sort of gave up on that, and now it's just one mic.
Do you remember what vocal mic you would have used with Lou Reed? Would it have been 67?
It would have been the same. It would have been the same. As I say, creature of habit. I've always been a creature of habit. I find something I like. I go out to a restaurant. If I've been there before and I've had something I like, guess what I'll have at the restaurant the next time I go there? The same thing as I liked last time.
I think one of the instruments we haven't talked about is acoustic guitar. I've seen kind of a lot of pictures of that varying a lot with the Beatles. Do you remember some of the standard mics you would have used with them?
D19C, we used fairly frequently. If you know the track Long, Long, Long on the White Album, the ending has this weird scraping sound on it, and that is George actually grabbing the D19 and using it to scrape up and down the strings. That's how I know on that one it was a D19. Let's see, 67, C12, then a Trident C12A. If I remember correctly, we might have used the Sony C38 on occasion at EMI on acoustic guitar. We used the Sony it's an interesting mic. It sounds good on a lot of things. It sounds good on a lot of things. It doesn't sound great on a lot of things. But we used it. It was a great general purpose mic. We'd use it on piano. We'd use it on acoustic guitar. We used it on brass. And obviously snare. Eventually, I was using it on. So it's quite possible we used that on acoustic guitar at times.
Do you remember the positioning you might have used?
Would have varied. Just depending on what we were after and what was being played.
Do you have something that you kind of might try first now, like a?
It's very strange. It's I don't know if I can actually describe it. It's angled down, and it's very close to where the pick's going to hit the strings, but it's angled down, so hopefully I get slightly less of the bass strings. So I always find I have to roll off a lot of low end on acoustic guitars. Maybe it's just because of the type of acoustic guitar sound I like, but for me, the best acoustic guitar sounds I got was when I owned my own acoustic guitar. It was a Gibson Dove, which was amazing. Guitarists didn't like playing it because it had the heaviest gauge strings that Gibson made on it. So, but once they played it and then heard the sound on it, that made it a lot easier for them, no matter how painful it was. That was really good. I love heavy strings on acoustic. Most guitarists don't like that, so it doesn't happen very often. But yeah, it's very strange the way I place mics, but it's what I do.
I've been thinking recently about, because how all the Beatles albums have quite a kind of unified aesthetic between the same album, but then it kind of changes quite a lot between different albums in terms of the frequencies and like the clarity and things like that. For example, Rubber Soul has a very sort of clear low mid, and it's quite bright, and then you go into Revolver, it's much more mid-rangey, kind of thicker low mids. Do you think there was a particular reason why it kind of changed generally between albums?
Number one, engineer. But Norman Smith, the engineer for the first 6 albums, was always trying to change the sound, but he could only do it to a certain extent because of rules that EMI had, and it was still only 4-track at that point. There was no bouncing between 4-track machines or anything like that. We had 4 tracks. When Jeff took over, he had a different set of ears, so he would have been doing things differently. He chose to use slightly different mics to Norman, although a lot of, at least in the beginning, a lot of them were exactly the same. It wouldn't surprise me if one of the reasons for that change was the amount of 4-4s that suddenly started to be done on Revolver. So obviously, each time you copy across, you're going to lose some of the clarity. No matter how, we managed to do it a lot of times, and it should have been a lot worse than it was. But thanks to the amazing techs at Abbey Road, that they kept the standard up for us with them. But yeah, we would have lost a bit each time we did it, and we were doing it a lot.
Would you be using anything on the whole mix bus then in terms of processing?
The only thing that we would have put across the mix bus would have been the Altec compressor. We would sometimes use one of those. But as I say, that's thinking. Primarily, all that we were thinking about was mono. So whenever I talk about that, it will just be the one thing. I'm sure we probably did the same when we came to stereo mixes, but they were almost throwaway anyway. So and up to the White Album, the stereo mixes were done so much later, and they are so different to the mono mixes which the Beatles had okayed. No one particularly cared what they sounded like, in all honesty. I have this great thing that I use in some of my talks. It's She's Leaving Home, and I've edited between the mono and stereo mix because they're in different tempos and different keys, because they forgot to put the vari-speed on when they did the stereo mix, and it is very disconcerting hearing the complete change in key. And but we didn't remember what we did, and then when we came to do stereo, because it was so much later.
Did the Beatles supervise the stereo mixes for the White Album?
They were more interested in them at that point, yes. Memory is quite amazing, I have come to learn. I, for years, have had this story about the stereo mix of Helter Skelter, which, in talking with Chris Thomas, he has a completely different story of the stereo mix of Helter Skelter. But I'll tell my story. That is that we'd done the mono mix. We were in number 3 studio. We did the mono mix, and then we were going to do the stereo mix immediately afterwards. And we come to the end of it, and I start to fade out exactly the same way as I did on the mono. I hit the bottom, and Paul then says, okay, now bring it back up again. Bring it back up again, slowly, slowly. I sort of look at him, what the hell's going on? I bring it up. He said, okay, yeah, that's good. Now start to fade it down again. I fade it down again. I get it down, and he says, okay, now bring it up quickly. And I bring it up, and it's just in time for I've got blisters on my fingers. I turn to him and say, what the fuck was that about? Come on, it's totally different from mono. He said, well, we have had lots of letters from fans about the differences between the mono and stereo. So we thought this time round we'd really make some differences and hopefully sell twice as many records. Boom. All about the money. Yeah.
How does Chris's story differ?
He seems to remember that Paul fell asleep during the stereo mix, and I went running in to get Chris in, saying, come and help me, Paul's fallen asleep. And it was him that said, bring up the I got blisters on my fingers. But there's a certain point for me that whether we would have gone through that without the Beatles' permission, I don't know. But we both have our own versions.
Is it true that those red desks have the faders in reverse in case anyone fell asleep on them?
No, that was the BBC had that. There are so many. Come on, there are so many stories about EMI that are completely untrue. All engineers were wearing white coats. No, they weren't. We had to wear suits and good sports jackets and trousers. But the only people wearing white coats were the electronic wizards. And the reason for that is they had to set up sessions, they had to clear them down. They were coiling up and all of these dirty mic cables. They would have to go into echo chambers, they had all of this stuff growing on the walls and all of that kind of thing, and they had to go in there. They didn't want to get their suits dirty, so they'd wear white coats to keep them clean. And and just all of those kind of things. There's been a lot of misrepresentation.
You mentioned the echo chambers there. Was the only reverb that the Beatles would have been using the actual real chambers there at Abbey Road?
No, we used DMT plates as well. They had several plates, and depending on what we were after, we'd use one or the other or both. Actually, I'm sure we must have used both. I'm trying to remember the Red Desk if there were two different echo sends. I don't think there were, but yeah.
Did you ever compress or EQ the reverb return?
No. Well, what we did do, they had this thing called Steed for the chambers, which was send tape echo echo delay is what it stood for. And what would happen is that the echo send was split. It would go directly to the chamber. It would also go through a BTR tape machine, so that it was slightly delayed. That was fed to the chamber, and it was kind of fed back somehow through the BTR and going back. So it elongated the reverb from the chamber a bit. We always had that going, and one of the worst things was John always liked to have reverb on either tape delay or reverb on his vocal in the headphones. And we're always dreading that the Steed tape would run out mid-take. Just that kind of thing. We always had to watch that.
Hey everyone, this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Tonalux and their brand new JC37 microphone. This is a clone of the old Sony C37A tube microphone designed with producer Joe Gicarelli, who was on episode 5 of the podcast. The original Sony mics were used on sessions with people like Jimi Hendrix, The Doors and The Wrecking Crew. In my opinion, these new Tonalux microphones are great for people with small studios and home studios looking to invest in one really great tube condenser mic. Unlike a lot of tube condenser microphones, these Tonalux mics are incredibly versatile, can be used on guitar amps, snare, kick drum, drum overheads, vocals, and almost anything that in a lot of situations a normal tube microphone couldn't handle the sound pressure of. And because you can get these microphones right up close to a lot of sources, they're great for recording in ideal spaces, which is what I do a lot of, as I have a portable recording studio. And another great thing about them is, even though they're hand-assembled in the USA, these mics are a lot cheaper than a lot of classic tube microphones as well. You can get a pair of them for the same price that you could get a single tube microphone from a lot of other manufacturers. Please visit tonalux.com/product/JC37 to see more information about them. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode. Did you ever use the actual room ambience for any deliberate reverb effects?
Reverb effect? Not really. On the Beatles sessions, I honestly don't remember using distant mics that much, especially if it were for drums, because we were always cutting other instruments at the same time, so we would have got too much leakage of the other things. That came, the whole thing of using room mics, for me at least, came later when you were cutting individual instruments, or there were ISO booths where the guitar amps, whatever, were in, so you didn't get too much pick up from other instruments.
What kind of reverbs were available at Trident?
EMT plates. That was it.
Right. So is that what you would have been using on the Bowie and Lou Reed? And
I would, when necessary, not very often, because they had, if I remember correctly, they had two EMT plates, one for the studio and one for the mix room. And so quite often you only had the one reverb, but at times when running late and mixing late and there was nothing going on in the studio, then I might use two plates. But generally, which is still pretty much the same today, I would decide what's the most important instrument or item within the recording for the reverb. set the reverb correctly for that, and then make sure everything else worked with that reverb. I hate the modern day thing of different reverbs on everything. It's reverb was made to sort of bring everything to just to accentuate everyone being in the same room, being in the same physical space, and having different reverbs on everything, to me, pushes everything apart as opposed to bringing it all together. So I'm not a fan of that.
You mentioned with the Beatles, them all recording together. Was there a kind of standard way that they would build up tracks, doing the drums and something else first, and then overdubbing?
It would always be the band first, in one form or another, be it drums, piano, guitars, drums, bass, piano, drums, bass, guitars. It was all, there were always at least 3 things would go down, normally 4 things at once, and then overdub from there, and then do a 4/4 and overdub more, and then do another 4/4 and overdub more.
Were you ever particularly worried about things like leakage or anything like that, or was it more just kind of worried about if it was a problem?
It was just worrying. It was thinking about the end result. Would the sound that we get, even if there was leakage, would it work in the end? And like the classic one for me is Your Blues, which was the one we did in the small room by the side of the number 2 control room. And that you bring up the bass guitar, and you get guitar, you get drums, you get everything coming through almost as loudly as the bass. Pull up the guitars. You had to learn to sort of get a blend that worked overall for it, and you had no other choice. When they're all playing in this small room loudly together, you're going to get leakage, so you just have to learn to deal with it. Most of the time, it shouldn't be a problem. I did one time for me, not fairly recently, that it was a problem for me. I did a mix. A new mix of Life on Mars, the Bowie track, which was just lead vocal, piano, acoustic piano, and orchestra. And the problem was, when we cut the track, even though Woody, the drummer, was in the drum booth with the doors closed, there was still enough leakage on the piano that you could hear the drums in a couple of places. So luckily I was doing the mix at Abbey Road, and they have this IT guy there that devised this thing specifically for Beatles work, basically, where he could separate instruments and to be able to give a better stereo mix or anything like that, or 5.1, which they've now moved to. But we used it. He managed to separate sort of drums and managed to pull out, whenever you could hear the drums through the piano mic, he could, with his program, he managed to get rid of the drums there, so we could do it, except I think there are 2 snare hits that come, but luckily David's singing at exactly that time, so you don't really hear them.
Was that program developed for the Giles remixes?
No, it was actually done before Giles started to do anything, but Giles has certainly used it.
How often would the Beatles or other people be doing live vocals along with kind of recording takes?
Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. I can't give you sort of a percentage or something like that. Obviously, there's enough video showing that Paul did the vocal live with for Hey Jude. I remember the first session that I ever did was a remake of Your Mother Should Know from Magical Mystery Tour, and Paul sang when we were doing that. My understanding is that John sang live on Day in the Life. So yes, sometimes they did, sometimes we kept the vocals, sometimes they didn't, and we would overdub later.
When you were overdubbing them, did John and Paul have kind of different approaches to recording vocals, as in would they prefer to do it all the way through and just do a bunch of takes, or do it more slowly, and would they have the lyrics finished, or, you know?
It was generally all the way through and punch for bits that didn't quite make it, and sometimes it would take several takes. Sometimes it would be very quick, but the approaches that were probably different was that Paul was more the perfectionist. He wanted to get everything right, so he'd probably do it more. And John, hating his voice, he wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. That's why ADT was invented, I'd have to say, by Ken Townsend, the maintenance guy at the time at Abbey Road, because John didn't want to have to sing twice to double track something.
Was that still being used on the White Album?
Oh, yes, a lot. Absolutely, but not necessarily just for double tracking. It was because from that invention, for what a better way of describing it, we also got phasing on things, and when John one day went and messed with it, and everything, the pitch was changing on whatever was going through it at that time, he called it flanging. And that term still stands for exactly what we did back then. And there's a lot of the flanging more so on the White Album than there is just ADT. One of the examples of that was Eric Clapton when he played on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He said he would only do it if he were to sound more like the Beatles. He didn't want to sound like Eric Clapton coming in and playing with the Beatles. So he wanted a Beatles sound. And one of the things was flanging it. And it was on, at some point or another, it finished up on the same track as the organ. And so when his guitar's being flanged, you hear the organ changing pitch as well. At times it can be a little unnerving, but it all adds to the effect.
Were they still doing manual doubling of instruments as well, or Al vocals? Did they do doubling vocals still manually?
Oh, they did. Because it's ADT is good, but it's an effect. It's not real. And they at times wanted the effect, at times they wanted real. So,
could you talk a little bit about your kind of transition from just engineering with David to producing his albums? Kind of how did your role differ as you became the producer?
I went through the thing of which a lot of engineers go through, where you'll be sitting there and you'll suddenly get let's call it an artistic idea, and you say to the producer, "You know what would sound great here? Behind this guitar solo, it'd be great to have a herd of trumpeting elephants." The producer thinks about it. He pushes the button down, says to the guys, "You know what? Let's try a herd of trumpeting elephants underneath that guitar solo." "Oh, okay. If you think it'll work." Elephants come in. You record the trumpeting. It doesn't work. Now, because it doesn't work, the button goes down. It was that was only Ken's idea anyway. I didn't think it would work, but I thought we should try it. If it worked, the producer took the credit. And as an engineer, you eventually get fed up with that, and I particularly wanted more. If I came up with something, I wanted to be the one to put it out there and see if it worked or not, and take credit if it did work. And engineering was just becoming, as I say, I'm a creature of habit. So the engineering was becoming very much the same all the time, and it was becoming boring. It was too easy for me. So I just wanted to have more say in the recording. So I had engineered a lot of the Space Oddity album and Man Who Sold the World with David and Tony Visconti producing. And David, after the lack of success, David gave up for a little while. He came in to produce a friend of his. And because I'd worked with David before, I was put on the session as the engineer. And during one of the tea breaks, we were talking, and he said he just signed a new management deal. They wanted to put him into the studio to record an album for them to shop a deal for him. He was going to produce it himself, but he didn't know if he was capable of doing that. Would I co-produce it with him? So I leapt at the chance. It was exactly what I wanted. And to me, I think that the transition from Tony to me was very much, David had a lot of ideas. The one song that his ideas had really been used was Space Oddity, which was a track that Tony refused to record. He hated it. Gus Dudgeon, who I learnt a lot from as a producer, he went with David's ideas, and it proved successful. Then the rest of the stuff was done with Tony, and Tony, in all fairness, he's the bass player, he was the arranger, he was all of these things, and David really didn't have that much to do with the recordings. They were his songs, he sang them, boom, that was it. From what I saw in the studio, anyway. And they weren't successful, so I think David needed to sort of put up or shut up. And he wanted his ideas to come through more. He, having worked with me on the 2 albums, I think he knew that I came from the George Martin, the Gus Dudgeon school of production, which is an artist is put into the studio for one reason, and that's to create. And you have to allow the artist the freedom to create. He knew I would do that with him, allow his ideas to come through and work with him on his ideas. And so he chose to work with me, and it proved successful for 4 albums.
Was David the one who asked you to work on Transformer, or was it more just that because you were working at the studio at the time?
I think it was more just because I was working with David at that time anyway, so I was just put on the sessions. I think I was still officially an engineer on the books of Trident, but that was really close to the end.
Does anything stick out in your memory about working on that album?
Other than the fact that the main vocalist may have been there physically, but certainly wasn't there mentally. Other than that, it was a David Bowie session, as far as I'm concerned. There was very little difference between doing a Bowie album and doing Transformer.
Was it David then arranging all the musicians, and I guess Mick Ronson as well?
And Ronno, yeah.
And did Lou not really have anything to do with the arrangements, or?
He would teach the song to Ronno. Then Ronno would teach it to the session musicians, and we'd come up with it from there. Like Walk on the Wild Side, Herbie Flowers, the bass player, the basic track was recorded with him playing with an upright bass. He came up to me afterwards and said, "Can I put another bass guitar on it?" And he started to explain the idea. I said, "Oh, hang on, I can't say yay or nay. Go speak with David." He went to David and explained it, and David said, "Sure, let's try it." And that's what finished up being the one of the biggest hooks to the whole song is that bass part and the 2 basses. It was amazing. So a lot of it was also left up to musicians to come up with their own things.
Do you remember the process of did they get so that kind of New Orleans type band to come in for one of the songs? And
it was with Herbie. Herbie brought in musicians that he knew. David had worked with Herbie on Space Oddity. He was a bass player on it. So David knew Herbie quite well. And Herbie was one of, if not the sort of most popular session bass player around at that time in England. And so he knew everyone and well-versed musically. So if David wanted a New Orleans jazz band, Herbie, can we get that? And Herbie would, yeah, I'll make a few phone calls. And because I think Herbie played with the band, musicians that came in, because Herbie played tuba on that. That was Goodnight Ladies, wasn't it?
Yes, I gone blank on the name when I...
Yeah, that's it.
Does anything stick out about working on All Things Must Pass?
Just working with George. Just one of the funniest people I've ever met. He was, and one of the nicest. It was just, just great to work with him, to get to know him. And I was blessed to spend a lot of time with him just before his passing as well, which was absolutely astounding. But with regard to All Things Must Pass, one of the things that we were working on at that time was the reissue of I think it was the 30th anniversary or something like that of All Things Must Pass, and it may have been the first time it was on CD. So we sit down in George's studio in Henley upon Thames. We put on the stereo master tape of All Things Must Pass. We start to listen to it, and we just look at each other and burst out laughing. And it was the same for both of us. Firstly, it was, here we are 30 years on, sitting in exactly the same positions as we were before, listening to exactly the same music. It was ridiculous to us at that point. But then the other thing was how bad we thought it sounded, with all of the reverb and all of that. Both of us would have loved at that point to have remixed it without all of that reverb, get rid of a lot of the spectrization of it. But we weren't allowed to by the record company. We had to just, and hopefully that won't happen. I hear whispers every now and again. How true they are or not, I don't know, that it's going to be remixed without all of that. And to me, without George there, it should not be done. There were things on the White Album that were in Giles's mixes that I know George would have hated. There were bits left in that George purposely had pulled out, but Giles decided to leave them in. It's without the artist there, I don't think it should be done. Anything should be touched. But at least let them have the approval. Don't do it when they're dead. But that's me. But no, it was just amazing to work with him.
How present was Phil Spector on those sessions day to day?
Not very. When I was working with George, he was there for all of the basic tracks, which were cut at Abbey Road with a great engineer called Phil McDonald, who did a lot of Abbey Road. He went on to work a lot with John, and then also he did a lot with George after All Things Was Past. So Abbey Road at the time was still 8-track. It was obvious very early on that they needed more than 8 tracks. So once they cut the basic tracks, George came over to Trident, and we were 16 by then. So we just transferred everything over to 16-track and started the overdubs and then mixed. Now, Phil wasn't there for any of the overdubs. He'd gone back to the States. We'd get a note from him every now and again with some ideas. Then when it came time to mix, the way that would come down is that George and I would start sort of 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, get a mix going, getting it close to where we thought it should be. Phil would come in at some point during the evening, listen to where we'd got. He'd pass some comments, some of which we would go along with, some of which we wouldn't. He'd leave and we'd complete the mix. George would go, I'd set up for the next day. We'd come in about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and the same process. We'd get a mix together. Phil would come in, pass comments, go. We'd finish it. So very little on as far as I'm concerned, working on the project.
When was what you called the spectrization, the kind of reverbs and everything, were they added during tracking, or was that a mixing thing?
Yeah, it's both. There was a lot, because things were mixed together, because it was only 8-track. Reverbs had to be recorded live on some of the things, and then we would add more if we had individual things. We'd add more on the mix.
Did you record the guess what has come out now as the All Things Must Pass demos, where it's just George, Ringo and the bass player? Did you record those?
I didn't record them, no.
Right.
They were done with. Are you referring to all of the ones, almost all of the songs that he recorded on All Things Was Past, or are you talking about the 5 demos that George did whilst recording the White Album?
I think there's an album that came out recently with a lot of just demos that were done near the time of All Things Must Pass, I think.
Okay, so yeah, I know which one that is. Yeah, no, I didn't do that. That was done at Abbey Road by Phil, I believe. But it's the reason I asked about the two. There's a great book out that details every recording session that the Beatles did by Mark Lewison.
Yeah.
I got that when it first came out, and I'm going through it and I'm thinking, this is really good. Wow, someone's actually got it together. This is really good. I got to the White Album part, and actually I may have gone straight to the White Album part. I don't know. Going through it, and I see this one story about my recording 5 demos with George on his birthday because the other Beatles didn't turn up. Now, my reaction at that time was, I never did that session. That's bullshit. And I just tossed them. This is just like one of the other books. They have no idea what's going on and kind of tossed it away. Didn't think about it until much later. I'm working at George's. I'm going through the tape library because one of the things that I had to do with George when I was working with him before his passing was find the originals of every bootleg that had been put out of George's material, because George wanted to put it all out officially. So I'm going through everything. I'm going through his tape library, and I suddenly come across the tape of the 5 songs that Lewison had said I'd recorded, and there in the bottom right-hand corner, KS, my initials, which are always put on there. I thought, my God, I'm going mad. I did actually do the session. I was completely floored because I had no recollection of ever doing it. Found that. I'm back in LA talking to a friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Brian Kehew, that was one of the 2 writers of Recording the Beatles. Once again, another amazing book. And I tell him the story about it. He gets back to me a couple of weeks later. He says, you know that those demos that you did with George? I said, yes. You mean the ones I don't remember? He said, yes. He said, I was just talking to one of the maintenance guys at Abbey Road that was there at that time. And I just happened to mention about that. And he said, no, Ken didn't do it. I did it. And Brian said, what do you mean? He said, well, we weren't allowed to engineer sessions. We were the electronics guys. We couldn't do anything else. But George wanted to record these 5 demos. There was no one else around to do it. So I did them. But I couldn't put my name on it. So Ken was working with him at that point. So I put Ken's initials on it. So it turns out that both I was completely right and Lewison was right, because he saw the tape and it had my initials. So it looked as if I did it, but my memory hadn't failed me. So that's 5 songs. But then there was the stuff that he did actually for Spectre, those other demos he did specifically for Spectre. And most of them are just him and acoustic, aren't they? But that bootleg has been out for a long time.
Well, those demos, the earlier demos, are those the ones that are released on the anthology albums, or are they yet to be released?
You know, I'm not sure what was used on that. So, I don't know.
You mentioned the Recording the Beatles book. Is that something that you use very accurate about what happened at the time?
It's as accurate as one can be. Brian and Kevin. My initial introduction to Brian, well before the book was ever finished. I was living in LA at the time, and I got an email, and it was from this guy called Brian Kehew. He would like to interview me about the recording of the Beatles at that time. Now, oh God, another one. What the hell, I've got nothing else to do, I'll do it. So I went and met with Brian, and I knew within sort of 3 or 4 questions that he knew more about Abbey Road and what went on than I did. He had spoken to everyone around and gone through paperwork and all of that kind of thing. Now, he was originally doing the book on his own, but then he got a phone call, the same guy that engineered those demos. He got a phone call from him saying, you know these questions you've been asking me about the recordings? Yeah. Well, I just had a phone call from a guy in Texas asking me exactly the same questions. He's doing a book as well. You might want to talk to each other because you're both coming at it from exactly the same direction. that was Kevin Ryan, and they spoke and finished up doing the book together. They work very well together, and that book came out, and just I know the amount that both Brian and Kevin do, trying to make sure that what they put in that book is as close to 100% true as possible. If one person tells the story, it's not true. It needs at least two, hopefully three, and maybe even some paperwork to back it up. Then it's true. So, as close as one can be with talking about recording at that time with the Beatles, because as I said, it was changing constantly. They've done a damn good job.
What was your role in recording Imagine? Because I know there were quite a few different sessions that kind of came together for that album.
I did very little. I don't think I actually did anything on the album in the end. I did a session at John's place. In the afternoon, we did a Yoko track, which went very well, amazingly enough. Then in the evening, we were doing one of the tracks for Imagine. It was I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, Mama, I Don't Want to Go to War. And John taught it to the musicians. They did some white powder before they went into the studio. They went in the studio, did a take. It wasn't very good. They came in, listened to it, and, I know what this needs. Some more white powder. They went out again. It was worse. And I think I remained for another couple of takes and then said, sorry, guys, I've got an early start in the studio tomorrow. I've got to leave. And that was the last time I ever saw John. So that was my only sort of dealings with Imagine. And it wasn't necessarily a pleasant one.
Did some of the other people you've worked with have any particular kind of ways or rituals about recording vocals? Maybe David Bowie, did he have any particular techniques? Again, was it just going through the song and then replacing bits?
He would, it's one take, beginning to end, nothing. On 95% of the stuff. On the 4 albums I co-produced with him, 95% of the vocals are first take. Beginning to, I'll get the level, go back to the beginning, hit record, and whatever he sang that first take through is what you still hear today. He was the ultimate performer in the studio. But it's because of that he got very bored in the studio with other people. If they were taking too long, no, forget it, we'll move on. Because he was so quick. He knew exactly what he wanted to put across, and there was no messing around.
Were you doing a lot of riding the vocals on the faders with him or with the Beatles?
Always. If not so much on recording, but on the mixing end. I now teach at Leeds Beckett University, and I get to listen to what a lot of the students do. And of course, they're doing most of it in the box. And you can't, it's very difficult to control vocals if you're doing it all in the box. And my complaint 90% of the time is that they will set the vocal level for one part of the song. And then as the arrangement changes, the band will get louder, the voice is too quiet, or the band will suddenly get much quieter. And the vocal is too loud, but they're not playing with it. That's one of the most important things for me in a mix, is being able to look after the vocal, make sure that every bit that needs to come through comes through the amount it needs to. Always taking into consideration that I'm thinking of the total overall thing. And there are times when other things need to be a little more powerful than the vocal. But I'm playing that vocal all the time.
Does anything come to mind with Elton John recording vocals?
Once again, just the ultimate professional. It wasn't first take, but it was very quickly. And then we might have to go in and punch a couple of things. But it was... That's why I've had the career I've had. I've worked with such talented people. I've had to do very little. It's just... I turn a couple of knobs, push up a couple of faders, and then my feet go up on the desk, and they do all the work. It's great. Been a great life.
I'm sure. Was that the same with Lou Reed, or was he a bit more difficult to?
No, it was. Look, he was he was actually there for the mixes. He never said a word. He just sat there. He was someplace else in his head. I don't know where. A couple of weeks after finishing the album, it was my wedding anniversary. And my wife and I went to a Chinese restaurant that was fairly close to Triton. And we're in there eating, and suddenly a whole bunch of guys from RCA, David's and Lou's record company, came in. And they saw me and all came over because I knew them all and all this. And they said, "Oh, we've got someone you'd love to meet." They said, "Lou, come here." Lou Reed was with him. He came over and he had absolutely no idea who I was. Absolutely no idea whatsoever. We'd been working together. It must have been for a month side, just a couple of weeks before that. So I think that says where his brain was at that point.
I think I've heard you mention before also you recorded a few things with Pink Floyd. Was that during your time at Abbey Road?
Yes. That was, I did the last project with Sid, which was a single Apples and Oranges and Paintbox. And then I did the first, I remember doing the first couple of sessions on the first project with Gilmour. The one I remember is Corporal Clegg. Now, that's the only song I remember doing with them, but according to paperwork, I did actually do more with them than just that, but I have no recollection of those sessions. One of the things, as I mentioned, I now teach at the Leeds School of Arts, which is through Leeds Beckett University. And one of the things that I'm there for and I try and do is teach this next generation what it used to be like, why the records that we did back then are still so popular 50 years on. And so much of it is to do with real performances and not going for that perfection. It should hit you. It should hit you up here, in deep down in your soul. Music should not. Some of it's for the head, but it's more. It should move you, and that's why with David, his vocals aren't perfect, but they are real. They move you. I give talks, other than just at the university. I give talks all over, and normally at the end of the main talk, I will play the ending of 5 Years from the Ziggy album, and by the end of that vocal, David was bawling his eyes out. Tears were pouring down his face. There was so much emotion in that performance. And that doesn't come through. I said about the mix, and sometimes things need to be a little more powerful than the vocal. I determined when I was mixing that it needed to be big. So the vocal was down. You didn't hear everything with the vocal that you could do when it's on its own. So what I put together is the ending starts off with the actual mix, and then I fade out everything except for acoustic guitar and David's vocal, so that the audience hear the emotion that he gave. And almost every time, some of the audience have been in tears by the end of it, because it is so moving. And that's what we need to get back to. Not I'll only sing the chorus once because you can just copy and paste it. All of that kind of thing. It's bullshit. It really, we have let technology take us over. We're not in control of it anymore. It controls us. All of those kind of things. Auto-tune. I've never used auto-tune in my life, and I won't. It's if they can't sing it properly in the first place, then they shouldn't be in there. Is my whole thing. So I'm at the university to try and push that kind of thing a little bit more than they see on the internet all over the place. And with you talking with people like Al Schmidt and us old timers, hopefully that will get across a little more to them, and rather than you have to use this plugin to get a great bass drum sound. No, you don't. You just need a good drummer, a good bass drum, and a good mic, and that's it. That's all you need.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in talking to kind of people from your generation and our generation, just about, because there's quite often, with some people, there's not a lot of interviews about how they actually kind of conducted sessions and things like that, and a lot of very important things that haven't really heard them talk about too much, because it's what I'm interested in, because I specialise in recording bands, kind of live, all playing together and doing all that sort of thing. So a lot of the questions I ask people are relative to what I do, and it's about, working with all these things and working with bleed and that sort of thing, and getting great performances.
That's the main thing. It's performances. What sells records, or at least what used to sell records, and I think why they're still so popular now, is it's the song and it's the performance. The rest is all bullshit. I've heard some great, amazing sounding records that have never sold a bean. I've heard some terrible sounding records that have sold a huge amount. The sound, yeah, it's nice. It adds something, but it's not the most important thing. It's the performance and the song are the two most important things. That's what's going to sell it. And so much of both the song and the performance is lacking these days. All of these lawsuits that are going on because people have stolen things, it makes absolute sense to me that they're stealing things, because I've heard of so many sessions that start off, they'll bring in a drummer or something, and they're writing sessions where they're playing old records. They say, I like that groove. Okay, let's try and work something around that. And they're actually basing what they're doing on old songs. Of course they're going to lift things from it, and it's going to sound similar. That's not the way to write. It comes from deep within you. Yeah. Even if initially you're calling it scrambled eggs and it finishes up being yesterday, that's the way it should be written. It's Seeing Rocket Man written in 10 minutes by Elton. That's my bitch session for today.